we're going to be sharing a story about a debate over how to teach reading and the impact that evidence has had on both stimulating the debate and also calming it because it's anchored to evidence. I'm going to introduce the three of us first before we get into it so you understand our respective roles in this. The three of us who are here include Glenn Webb and Greg Smith and myself. Glenn's brought his talent to Morgan Hill for 36 years. He just retired at the end of last year and spent about 2/3 of that time there teaching science and math at the high school level. He then stepped up to the principal's role and for the last 6 years has been in the district office where he ran curriculum, instruction, and assessment department. Among his many contributions to the district include designing their strategy, writing their annual plans, and guiding principals through the site planning process. 2 years ago, his district plan was given top honors by the California School Boards Association, which is probably the first time any plan in California has gotten recognition from any organization. So there's something in the special mojo he brings to this. Greg Smith, with whom I've worked for 2 decades, is a Renaissance technologist. He does a lot of things well, including data architecture, database development, visualization design, user interface, user experience, and report design. He built the evidence that Glenn used, and that's the evidence we'll be sharing with you today, and he'll be telling you about the backstory, about how he built it and what's under the hood. I'm Steve Reese, and I started Schoolwise Press a long time ago, and I now lead its K12 Measures team. We've been analytic partner or accountability report publisher to over 240 California districts in just over 20 years. I'm also co-author of a book, Mismeasuring Schools' Vital Signs, published by Routledge, that's coming out this September. But relevant to this talk is that I've had the pleasure to work with Glenn for just about 5 years, bringing my team to his district to deliver workshops on measurement and building evidence for planning and instructional purposes. So let's talk about the story of this evidence in action now that you know about us. Glenn had a tough job in front of him, which is to persuade elementary principals that his district even had a problem teaching reading. The story unfolded in a district that was starting to debate how to teach reading. So I want to background all of you on the debate itself, because it's important context for this conversation. The majority of principals and teachers favored a method known as balanced literacy. It's an approach that favors exposure to interesting texts, and it values comprehension the most, and it rests on an idea that kids will learn to read almost as naturally as they learn to speak. It's also known for taking shortcuts through the work of decoding and teaching students tactics that include guessing when they're unable to sound out a word. The other side of the debate favored teaching reading using methods known as structured literacy. This approach favors heavier exposure to phonics and phonemic awareness, favors exposing that knowledge base earlier, and it avoids shortcuts to sounding out words. Of the 8 elementary schools in Morgan Hill, Glenn's district, a couple of them favored his structured literacy approach. The other 6 favored balanced literacy. And even within school staffs, there were advocates of both camps. Let's talk about the conflicting views about how to test emerging readers. Different choices, site by site, of instructional materials led to different favorites in the assessment world. Most teachers favored the test provided by the primary provider of instructional materials, Fountas and Pinnell. The teachers favoring phonics-heavy instruction valued different tests. Naturally, the pattern was for teachers and their school sites to choose the tests that were compatible with their instructional materials and methods. But here's where we felt we could help. We felt that no one was looking at all the tests their students were taking to better gauge their progress in reading. They could have seen evidence from 3 or 4 test results for second graders, for example, but teachers tended to embrace the one test they liked and disregard the rest. So the disagreements about the meaning of test results is a natural thing. But the natural disagreement, since numbers don't speak for themselves after all, was made larger by the bigger debate about how to teach reading and teachers favoring different tests based on their position about how to teach reading itself. The consequence, most educators believed that Morgan Hill's reading results were perhaps not great, but no worse than the rest of California's districts, and that improvement should come from better delivery of the curriculum they had in hand. Other teachers believed their students' reading results were probably a function of the kids themselves. But a smaller group of teachers and some district leaders, particularly Glenn, believed that Morgan Hill had a problem fundamentally in how it taught reading, and that its problems were actually more severe than those of other districts whose students were most like their own. Yes, Hannah, thank you for that reminder. Chat box is available for questions or comments, which we'll pick up at the end. Thanks, Hannah. So Glenn's tough challenge was to persuade the majority of teachers and their principals that the district had a serious problem teaching reading. And this process required tact, it required diplomacy, it required lots of evidence, and it required lots of conversation. Because he spent years building personal bonds of trust with these principals, that foundation of trust was a great beginning point for those difficult conversations, and his background mattered immensely here. So before Glenn brings you into the Morgan Hills world, I'd like to talk to you about the California context, just to let you know that it matters that this is a California school district. I'll offer a handful of evidence of literacy of adults and kids, and then I'll talk about policy very quickly. First of all, California adults rank near the bottom in the combined studies of the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies. California here is 6th from the bottom. What about kids? On the National Assessment of Educational Progress in 2019, 4th graders' results were lower than those results for their grade level peers in 25 states. They were higher than results in just 4 states. Another troubling sign that reading in California is not in good shape. Let's look at the California students' results on the Smarter Balanced Assessment. Again, I've picked the 2019 test cycle. It's the last year prior to the pandemic. I've picked 4th graders, and I've picked all students. Simply put, half the 4th graders are meeting or exceeding the standard for English language arts, and half were not. But I want to share with you one other surprising finding by an independent group, the California Reading Coalition. They published a report card looking at 3rd graders in the 287 districts who returned their surveys. It wasn't all 3rd graders, though. It was a specific subset of 3rd graders. They were Latino Hispanic kids considered to be socioeconomically disadvantaged. California Reading Coalition felt that this was a proxy for how the most challenged readers were doing, and that this was a good way to take stock of how reading in the state is doing in general. The surprising results, one of the most highly regarded districts in the state, Palo Alto Unified, right in the backyard of Stanford University, was in the bottom 10 of these 287 districts, and right next to them was Morgan Hill. Finally, before I pass the baton, I want to talk about 4 California policies related to reading: dyslexia screening requirements, the state policy on how to teach reading, the quality of accountability evidence related to reading, and the academic growth measure. In each of these 4 areas, California didn't do much to help Morgan Hill or other districts with struggling readers. Unlike the 39 states that do require dyslexia screening, California does not. California has no official state policy on how to teach reading. The quality of its accountability evidence about reading is poor, and there is still no academic growth measure in the California dashboard, the basic vital sign signal system for how schools and districts are doing. Let me pass the baton to Glenn so that he can tell you what he was able to do within this California context in Morgan Hill Unified. Glenn.
Well, thank you, Steve, for that very gracious introduction and framing this conversation for us. And thank you to all our attendees today. I hope to do justice to understanding our problem, why we reached out to work with an analytic partner like K12 Measures, what we learned a little bit along the way, and how we've begun to kind of implement those things. And our problem on the surface seems quite easy, that half our students are not able to read by grade level, on grade level by grade 3. That's been our goal for some time, and actually it's really just become a statewide goal here recently. Tony Thurman has announced that as a goal just in this last several months. So we've been working on this for some time and got some background on it. We knew we had a problem, but truly understanding the scope of that problem. How severe was it? Did it rise to the level of urgency that would capture the attention of our rank and file and site leaders to spur them to action? That was really part of the problem that I had to negotiate by moving from my understanding of the analysis of the raw data to how to bring that to the audience, our audience, in order to set the stage for some change. So that problem, of course, that half our students, in the next slide, you can see it really was a problem that affected all student groups, and some student groups certainly more severely than others. Even the highest scoring groups, about 2/3 of them could read on grade level, but the lowest scoring only a fifth or so. That there was certainly evidence of inequitable outcomes and opportunities to do a whole lot better. So we knew that this was kind of a systemic problem, and probably had to do with our deeper causes than instructional, to include programmatic and so on. So we went about trying to address this by determining the starting point, and right away we were confronted with an agreement on the why. Steve mentioned the kind of the debate between balance and structured literacy, and that certainly is a big part of the playing field in our district. We have quite a contingent of teachers that adhere to either of those two, perhaps some considered opposite ends of the spectrum of the philosophy about how to teach reading, and little understanding or agreement on what the true research about teaching reading said. So we knew that was going to be a big part of our need, how to convey the why through an understanding of what that research would be. So I had a problem within my own staff of really having limited staff. I was a director of a curriculum instruction and assessment, but my group of teachers on special assignment who worked with me on these projects tended to come and go quite frequently. They became kind of the bullpen for site leadership needs, or moving into administration or moving into other positions. So it became oftentimes a short-term position for teachers who had a lot of talent and abilities, but made it difficult to get traction for a long-term project. So I knew I had a need for some steady and consistent support. We also had some limits on how to demonstrate reading proficiency in the early grades. Even the state assessment started in third grade, and that wasn't really consistent with our goal of trying to have students on grade level by that time. We knew we were going to need ways to accurately measure their reading and basic skills much earlier than that, beginning with as soon as we got our students in transitional kinder and kindergarten. So that was kind of what we saw as some of our starting points. Our local context, we had a variety of different things, of course, that we also had to address. And then we've talked about the different pedagogical beliefs about structure and balance literacy was certainly a big piece of that. But there were also different beliefs about assessment itself. Definitely a debate about assessment versus instructional time. And if you spend more time in assessments, you're taking away from instruction. Whether or not assessments are used effectively to inform that instruction. Those types of practices vary greatly especially in our early grades. There was a lot of teachers at one end of that spectrum that might believe we already know what our students need and who they are, and we don't need assessments to tell us that. To others that were very data driven and data minded and had a lot of data acumen. So they really ran the full gamut of abilities there. And then there was another big variable, which was implementation fidelity. We had programs and training and professional development, but were the teachers really adhering to that? And sometimes were the teachers able to keep up with training because of turnover year to year? In an adoption, it follows an 8-year cycle along with the state boards and the California Department of Education cycle. They visit each of the subject areas once every 8 years. And they sat on an adopted framework that lays out the instructional pedagogy and direction that also is updated every 8 years. For us, we start with that, and then our local policies derive from that cycle. We go through an adoption process of review and adoption, and then we invest in a program. For us, that's a $2.1 million investment in an English language arts program out of an annual set aside for instructional materials of really just about $500,000, to kind of put that in perspective. So it's certainly a thing that we want to get right. And it's not a thing that you can revisit on a shorter cycle because of the cost and investment involved. So you want to get it right. You want to do a good job. You want to make sure that you're implementing a strong program with the right pedagogy, with the supported training for the full cycle. So those were all variables we wanted to address. And following that that system, I've listed the programs that we use there. It's just for your general background, but really they derive from the state's framework, which in the last framework in California was pretty heavily skewed towards the balanced literacy end of the instructional spectrum. And maybe that's best reflected in the intervention program. The intervention programs within the ELA framework identified by the state board, Read 180, which does have some structured literacy components, but it really begins in grade 4. It targets grades 4 through 8, which of course does little to make sure that students are on grade level by grade 3. It really is based more on who's behind once you get to that checkpoint. So we wanted something that identified and intervened earlier as we were learning the science of reading, suggested that early intervention is really where the best results can be found. So next slide. And so why with K12 measures, on the administrative level, I knew I needed the capacity and I knew I needed expertise. I knew I needed a way to demonstrate these needs to our rank and file in order to make believers, in order to get a common understanding of the why, and to really make use of assessment data in a way that could be understood by a range of teachers and leaders that had different levels of data proficiency. We of course had some goals with developing that common understanding because we'll be coming up on the next ELA adoption in a couple more years. We wanted to build a truly effective model for identifying as early as we could who are the students that need extra help, and make sure that we weren't having any misidentifications and missing anybody through the cracks or over-serving students that perhaps were not in need. We had been relying on teacher referrals as opposed to data initially in our intervention efforts. We wanted also to be able to demonstrate that we needed to improve Tier 1 instruction, regular classroom instruction, Tier 1 instruction, a term that comes from multi-tiered systems of support, but general classroom instruction, so that as many students as we could reach proficiency there and limit the number of students needing additional support. to kind of that rule of thumb of about 10 to 15% of the students. That's both consistent with the MTSS guidelines that the state puts out, as well as kind of consistent with what research says about the general population and the number of students that struggle with processing issues in learning to read. So then we also wanted to make sure that what we learned became durable. So we wanted to incorporate that into our strategic plans to ensure that resources would be there, that there'd be a maintenance of our focus, and that we'd have a way to measure accurately our progress. So those were kind of the reasons we were reaching out. And sure, we needed evidence to convince the rank and file. We needed research to understand where we were going, and we needed a capacity to put those things to work. So local assessments that were generating data that we were putting into our student information system. But some of those were highly subjective. The dyslexia screen is a rubric that teachers answer about their subjective take on a student's ability to read. Fountas and Pinnell is a one-on-one running record where, again, that we were seeing in our data problems with calibration and the consistency of scoring from one teacher to the next. We started a more objective and higher quality measure, the measure of academic performance during this time, in order to prepare students and have a better feel for how they might do on the state tests. And we weren't seeing great agreement between some of those subjective early measures and these more objective standardized measures. And so that was kind of where we started. And as a result, we've begun to implement a few additional early assessments. Been very interested in identifying students with processing disorders and screening. So we were developing local screens and then began working with UCSF, which has a dyslexia center and is now charged with trying to develop a dyslexia screen for the state. California doesn't currently have one, but they're working on that project. That's a higher quality approach. It's kind of three-pronged, involves family history, basic skills assessments, and some teacher observation. And then we've also added in some early basic skills assessments. Kind of the assessments in bold here are those that we've picked up on as a result of our work with K12 measures. And the key phonics, for example, is trying to focus in on early decoding skills, matching those letter sounds and consonant vowel patterns with being able to match to verbal vocabulary, as is very important to that decoding process. And then trying to build similar, what might be considered DIBELS-like assessments in TK and K using a data collection tool known as ESGI. So we've tried to shift the bar to include more early assessments, as well as improve the quality of those assessments through our work. And so in the next slide, what we'll do is kind of maybe go back to Steve. We'll talk a little bit about how we took some of this work out to our site leaders.
Thanks, Glenn. Certainly, reading is complicated, but the measuring of reading is additionally complicated. And with many measures of reading, it's extra complicated. So what were the range of skills principals brought to interpreting this? What was their tolerance for complexity? We had to take stock of this. And these workshop sessions were half day long. They centered on the improved use of evidence and school site plans. This was not detached from the work of the day. This was centered on the work of the day for principals. So it was definitely an applied set of talks about measurement. And it gave them ample room to actually present their own interpretation of how their own schools were doing for peer review, and also for our comment and critique. Following these group half-day workshops, we had one-on-one discussions with each of the principals who were in the room. These one-on-one discussions allowed them to ask questions they might have been a little reticent to share overall. A little shy about showing what they didn't know, but they were extremely valuable for being able to get down to the questions those principals brought to the table. The evidence challenge of proving that the district had a problem teaching reading required stating the problem in a form that had context. We centered, and Glenn made this possible, was to frame the question in terms of how Morgan Hill was doing at teaching reading compared to other districts with highly similar students. Not districts nearby, not districts that principals favored, but districts whose students were most like their own. The board needed this evidence as much as principals and educators. So the comparative framing of the question was well aimed at all three audiences. By the way, this meant we also walked away from official measures or the plan objectives in the prior year. It was a fierce focus on comparative measures. What we did is we found a set of 14 districts whose students were highly similar to Morgan Hill's based upon three attributes of students, irrespective of the district's hand on them. One, students' parents' level of education. Two, students' level of English fluency, in effect, the percent of kids who came to school and were considered to be English learners. And third of all, the percent of kids who qualified for meal subsidies. So what did this do? This enabled us to control for the variability of students as much as possible. Great, could you go back to the prior slide for a sec? Thanks. Okay, so I just wanted to show that this way of visualizing results required some familiarity with reading relative measures. Morgan Hill was on the center line. It is an orange dot. Each of the 14 similar districts is an empty circle stratified along each of those three lines of student attributes. And you can see this is one district who in parent education was just 7% different from Morgan Hill. On low income, about 5% difference, and an English learner composition identical. Great, okay, now let's go to the next slide. Okay, so having given principals a good deal of time to get used to both relative comparative measures and the visual vocabulary of bubble charts, and third of all, the concept of quasi-longitudinal measurement, we said, let's take the state assessment data and reorganize that evidence so that they could see how the graduating class of 2024, for instance, and looking only at kids fluent in English, did on the English language arts test, starting in grade 3 and more or less the same kids through the next 4 years to grade 7. And here's the answer to that question. The vertical axis, by the way, is scale score on the English language arts test. In the start of this all, in the leftmost column in 3rd grade, these kids who appear in orange were higher than most other districts and well above that black horizontal line that you see was a state average scale score for all kids in that grade level in that year. But by grade 7, the Morgan Hill kids are now below that horizontal black bar, that is below the state average scale score, and near the bottom of the stack of highly similar districts. This really pushes the question forward in a way that can't be escaped, which is, could the collective impact of being in our schools for this set of 5 years really result in less progress in English language arts than occurred in other districts with highly similar kids? Let me also tell you, there was anecdotal evidence of the problems of reading that were hard to miss. We heard one principal remark in a workshop she led a middle school, "Why do you send me so many kids who can't read?" addressing her elementary colleagues. And the other evidence was that there were so many kids referred to for reading supports. Glenn referred to this as tier 2, that they use the term triage in the district to describe the overflow, a term usually reserved for how to manage battlefield hospitals or emergency rooms after a natural disaster. So again, observational evidence combined with visual evidence of test taking, what proved to be really persuasive. But the second step in the process required we go below aggregate data about graduating class cohorts. We wanted to serve principals better. What did they want to know? They wanted help managing teaching of reading. In order to do that, there were very practical questions on the table for them. Which students should we be referring to Tier 2 instruction for extra help? And were some of my teachers actually referring the right kids more often than others? And a third question, is my school doing a good job teaching reading to our kids relative to our other elementary schools? So in order to get at the answers to these questions, we took a jump into student level data, of course, and built visual expressions of that for every school site. And we expressed it in the form of scatter plots, not before they were familiar with the form of representation, but after, and showing two test results on a field where the entity on the screen is not abstract, a representation, a central tendency of some bunch of kids, but an individual kid had enormous power. So let me just recap how we addressed the barriers to the analytic conversation. One, we made them familiar with the visual vocabulary before we introduced it. Two, the unfamiliarity with assessment metrics, we remedied in conversation over those planning workshops I mentioned earlier. Scale score is not a concept that these principals were taught in their pre-service education or in service until we sat down with them. Third, the lack of clarity on how kids learn to read. We helped Glenn address that by doing a literature review and sending him digests of findings and links to the papers so that his team and the reading specialists and principals could get up to speed on what the research showed. We're not spending much time on that in this talk, but it turned out to be a big help to Glenn in persuading people that the problem might be just as real as he was claiming it to be. All right, I'm going to pass the baton to Greg here, who's going to explain how we built these visualizations and a bit about the data behind it. Greg.
Thanks, Steve. So very briefly, when we embarked on this part of the project, we gathered up 5 years of data for most of the elements you see here. Obviously, we gathered up the assessments that Glenn's already discussed and their participation in English learner and Tier 2 support programs, as well as the usual demographics. As is always the case with the initial data acquisition, there were some holes. We worked with what we had, and it's really very much the art of making do with what's at hand. These are the actual percent of students at those 14 districts, plus the statewide average you can see there. They're just arranged in rank order. Moore Park, wonderfully successful, 73% of their students in third grade met the state English language arts goals. Morgan Hill's near the bottom. And you can reduce all of that data to one picture. And this is a representation that's very easy for people to get the whole picture of where Morgan Hill is in relation to these very similar districts. I'm going to break away here for a moment and switch over to the tool that we used in these conversations. The tool's called Tableau. It's off-the-shelf software to help visualize data. We've tried to constrain the vocabulary, the visual vocabulary that we use to what's really, for the most part, 3 kinds of visualizations. This leaderboard, which you've seen twice now. I'm showing you this in the tool because in conversation, people will often want to dig a little bit deeper we've hidden from the initial view some of the particulars, scale scores. They're there if you love scale scores. I'm not a huge fan of them because I move between so many different tests at one time. And indeed, we've talked about the subgroups as well. We can easily switch the subgroup that we're showing. So we're only focusing on the students who are fluent in English. We can switch around to see how the students who aren't yet proficient in English are doing, and Morgan Hill suddenly looks quite different. So it's this interactivity that allows us to hide some of the detail, but expose it when people are interested. The ability to answer some questions on the fly. Obviously, this tool, this particular slide can't answer all questions, but it allows for us to sit down with the principals and start to make some progress in understanding, in the case of the leaderboard, where does Morgan Hill stand? Do we really have a problem? The question that follows on, of course, was, well, how good is the evidence that we have to work with our students? How can we identify the students who should be referred to additional support? And indeed, that brings us to the scatter plot that we see on the screen. This is a really straightforward, every dot represents a student at some intersection between how they scored on the Fontes and Pinnell assessment. This is the teacher's assessment running record. And in the case of, these are second graders, the nominal score for early and second grade would indeed be somewhere right around 2.0. On the left, we have the NWEA's measures of academic progress. I'm using the percentiles instead of scale scores here just to make it a little easier for folks who aren't familiar with the cut points. And as is true of pretty much all the scatter plots we use, we first try to coach folks to think about these as quadrants. And here I've highlighted what's nominally the F&P early second grade reading level in the vertical dark bar, and you'll see the measures of academic progress on the horizontal bar there. So this student is pretty much where you'd expect them to be. We don't see a great deal of disagreement here between the measures of academic progress score, which is slightly above the median, and the F&P score, which is just shy of the 2.0 nominal. One of the things that quickly becomes apparent when you start to walk through these scatter plots is that something's not as expected right here, for example, in this quadrant. Here, we've got students who are assessed by their teachers as being well above grade level, early and second grade. But in an almost contemporaneous assessment with MAP, they're clearly below the median. So that teachers would assign this collection of students who genuinely seem to have a broad range of English language skills, if not reading skills specifically, suggest that these assessments don't line up very well. So that conversation is indeed what led to some of the red X's that you saw when Glenn was describing their early state of what tests were administered when versus the introduction of some new higher quality tests. We took the very basics of this scatter plot, and I'm not going to walk you through every step of how we got from the most basic representation we were just looking at to the final product, which I'll show you in just a moment. But here, we've simply changed the shape of the EL students so that they stick out. They can easily distinguish between the two. And in fact, we can simply disappear the English learners in the course of a conversation to declutter that. So let me jump ahead to the finish line. This is the tool that the K12 Measures team sat down with the principals to walk through. It differs, aside from the addition of all the controls you see around the periphery. It differs by the addition of one last factoid, which is, were the students currently in the second tier of the multi-tier support system versus those who weren't? I'm about to, as I said earlier, these are actual student level scores. And if in the course of conversation, we'll hover over these with a principal, the top of this tooltip, of course, has the student's name. We don't want the student to be a number. It's way too abstract. So you'll see this, by the way, is not their actual student ID. It's a fictitious number altogether. But when you see someone like this, this particular student who is enrolled in the second tier support, in an odd juxtaposition. So second grade scored fairly low on the Fontes and Pinnell assessment, but top quartile actually in MAP. You can hover over that student and get a really quick snapshot of some of the key demographic factors and of course their assessment history at the bottom. So it's a way to hide some of that detail until you really want to get a little deeper dive on, say, this particular student. So let me switch back to Steve, who is going to walk through the conversations in more detail and offer some exemplars of those conversations.
Great, Greg, thank you. What we're trying to enable the principals to do, who are really our customers, when we designed all this, was to help them avoid this kind of thing. The thing that makes so many people who are brave enough to lead a school site wince and recoil in horror is encountering ghosts from the statistics books they had to pick up at one time and then hope they'd never see again. Looking at a confusion matrix, running regressions, looking at formula were not in store. And I think, Glenn, correct me if I'm wrong, I think once we showed people that we had an appreciation for the practical approach to pattern identification using visual methods, that they took a big sigh of relief and said, okay, I'm in, I'm not going to be squirming in my seat. So this is what we help them avoid. And in its place, yes, okay, this is what we help them see, which is, in this case, a juxtaposition of what, very similar to what Greg had just shown you. The Fontes and Pinnell fall score for grade 2 is on the horizontal axis, and the measure of academic progress from NWA for reading is on the vertical. In this case, I am using scale scores. So we can mouse over a kid like this and say, how does it come to be that based on a kid's measure of accuracy when reading, which is what the Fontes and Pinnell running record does, the kid's evaluated to be below grade level when reading. But when the same kid takes just weeks away a test that measures comprehension and meaning and gets at elements of reading of a different sort, they're able to score at the third grade level. That's a pretty wide discrepancy. And if nothing else, principals took away from this a sense that evidence from one test won't do, no matter which test, but that if these values could be expressed together, then something more sound can be concluded. As much as teachers in the classroom are coping with the complexity of two-legged life forms with minds that can't be read, disambiguating, reducing complexity of the measurement instruments is high on their list. So they move naturally, for reasons I entirely understand, to wanting to look at one test. The test they embraced, this Fontes and Pinnell test, was so discordant with the interim assessment from Northwest Evaluation Association that we were able to show them in these rectangles groups of kids who are evaluated at grade level based on phonics and Pinnell running record, but measuring either below grade level or above based on the interim assessment measure of academic progress. So the visual approach to revealing this complex information also lent itself to an authentic Venn diagram. We could show areas of agreement between the two assessments and the degree to which that agreement occurred. And we could show areas of disagreement. And talking about zones of agreement and disagreement, far more comfortable for the educators we work with than talking about true positives, false positives, and the rest of that. When we got down to the student level, the scatter plot enabled us to do something really valuable to site leaders. They could sit down with teachers whose classroom they were looking at. And this is a school view of second graders and the spring tests given for both phonics and Pinnell and measure of academic progress. And here's one kid, name blanked out, who's in tier 2. Their dot appears in gold. And they're apparently a grade level behind based on the phonics and Pinnell running record, but scoring above the 70th percentile on the measure of academic progress. Does that kid belong in tier 2? Remember, triage was the word being used in the district. Are the right kids being sent for help? This is the converse of that, which is a kid who by both measures in both assessments was struggling with reading, not sent to tier 2. There may have been good reasons. We're just analysts, we're the evidence people. We don't presume that anyone's wrong, but we want the evidence to be put in the hands of the people who are right at the scene of the action. And this is what led principals to be able to confer with teachers with something on the screen that was much better than either test results on the page in front of them. One last benefit of the use of the scatter plot when looking at English learners was the ability to see the skill of English learners on measures of reading in second grade relative to their English only peers in the classroom enabled us to flag possible students possibly ready for reclassification to English fluent, which would change that kid's course assignment and experience in the classroom from next year on. The official test of this in California might have produced different results, but these two accepted measures of reading had to come into consideration, we hoped, when students who were classified as English learners were being reevaluated. So there's a lot of power in this, and making multiple measures work in a practical sense, I think, is the challenge. Yeah, this is where we welcome your inquiries. My email address is at the top. Our website address is just below that. And we've got 7 minutes. Let's open it up to questions. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please let us know. We've got a lot more stories to share, and we'd like to hear yours as well. To connect, just email me, Steve Reese, at the address you see below. I look forward to hearing from you.